Hello and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto the hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Tom Wright, and this week I'm speaking to Philipp Grüll and Christoph Giesen, authors of the new book, The Chinese Phantom, The Hunt for the World's Most Dangerous Arms Dealer. So Christoph and Philipp, welcome to Whale Hunting. It's great to have you here.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
So congratulations on your book, The Chinese Phantom, which comes out next month in Britain, in English. It's already out in German, I believe. Tells the amazing story of Carl Li, whose alias is Li Fangwei. And he is, I would call him probably one of the world's least known important people. And we love at Whale Hunting to talk about these people who operate in the shadows, but they are incredibly powerful in this sort of underworld. And I think this character really shows how the world really works. Now, he is one of the world's foremost arm dealers. What I want to know is, how did you get onto Carl Li's trail initially?
Yeah, actually, it was one of our colleagues. We wrote the book together, the four of us, Christoph, Frederik Obermaier, Bastian Obermayer, and me. And Frederik, he had he was a year in the US at Harvard University, had a Nieman Fellow. And as a journalist, and a few years before he did the Panama Papers story, he and Bastian, they were the ones who got the Panama Papers, initially this massive leak. And he was there and was approached by someone who investigated the Carl Li case before, and always wondered, are there traces of this Carl Li in the Panama Papers? And he told him about his name, and Frederik had never heard about it before, about Carl Li or Li Fangwei. But he searched the Panama Papers and he found a few traces there. And when he got back, we spoke about it, and I did a lot of arms stories at the time, arms exports and things like that. And he asked me, have you ever heard about this guy? There's a $5 million bounty on his head. And he's supposed to be the most important arms dealer in the world. And I said, no, I've never heard about him. And he also said he never heard about him. And then the idea was born to search for him. And this was actually the start. Yeah.
So the Panama Papers, of course, were a massive leak of an offshore database through a law firm of all these people, many of them nefarious characters who had accounts offshore in Panama and elsewhere. And Carl Li appears in those a couple of times, and that's like the thread that you begin pulling on to find out about this guy. Now, Christoph, this is not an unknown person. He's got a $5 million bounty on his head from the FBI, as Philipp just mentioned. Explain why he's so sought after. I mean, this guy's still on the run. Why is he so sought after by the Americans and by others?
Yeah, he's been sought after that much because he was supplying the Iranians with a lot of components for their rocket program. So, the FBI and also apparently other secret services are believing that he's the most important figure in the supply chain. So literally all parts that the Iranians needed to improve their rockets, they have gotten through Carl Li, mostly from China. So the Iranians at the beginning were buying North Korean rockets, but they had a problem with the range. So North Korean rockets at that time had a range of roughly 1,000 kilometers, but the Iranians wanted to target Israel. And from the western Iranian border to Tel Aviv, it's up to 1,300 kilometers. So they had to improve actually the range of those North Korean missiles they've gotten, and also they needed to make them more precise. And with both of these tasks, Carl Li helped the Iranians a great deal.
So how do you become an arms dealer? Tell us about Carl Li. Where's he from? And he's Chinese. Where was he born? How do you get into that role? I mean, I guess a lot of our listeners have probably read or seen the TV show The Night Manager. And you have this vision of sort of like a nefarious character who operates internationally, has a lot of contacts. But one of the questions people are going to have is, well, how do you get arms? And how do you transfer them? You have to have a connection probably to a state, don't you?
Well, what he was selling is not directly arms. We cannot imagine him like somebody who's like selling rifles or tanks. It's components for those arms and for these rockets. So we're talking about microchips, about so-called gyroscopes, so very small components that actually can be used for other things. So they're actually dual-use products. So there, we can imagine it more like a merchant who is buying components that can be actually bought legally in China, but you cannot, under no circumstances, sell them to Iran. So you need to have a so-called end-user certificate if you buy those things, and you cannot export them to certain countries. But that's what he's done, and that's how his business model looked like. So where is he from? That was one of the questions you asked. So he's from the northeast of China. He was born during the Cultural Revolution, and he was then moving to the city of Dalian, which is a port city, also in the northeast of China. And that's where he set up his network and was starting to sell components to Iranian companies.
So do you have any sense of how he initially made contacts with the Iranians at the beginning of his business? And I imagine he wasn't always a dealer in dual-use technologies. He probably was a normal businessman at one point. Were you able to pinpoint when he tips over into illegal activities?
Like sources from the US who had an eye on him. Also, like in the early 2000s, they said this was the time when he appeared on the radar for the first time. They got the raw intelligence from the intelligence agencies, and they were seeing that there are companies owned by this figure exporting to Iran on a regular basis. And it was like, as Christoph mentioned, gyroscopes who help ballistic missiles to navigate. And it was also things like graphite or aluminum who helped to make the missiles lighter and to fly a higher distance because they are not so heavy anymore. And and at that time he really got into business, and it was around 2005, or I think 2004, that he was sanctioned and designated for the first time by the US. And the question how he got in touch with the Iranians, that's not so clear. But what we know is that he was in touch with the Iranian embassy in Beijing, that he had contact people there, and that he also went to Tehran with direct flights from time to time. You can see quite a few things and get quite a sense of it if you look at the WikiLeaks cables, because at that time, the US embassy in Beijing was always reaching out to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Chinese, and telling them, we have a problem here. There is this guy. He's called Li Fangwei. He has this company. He has that company. Please stop him. And then the Chinese always say, oh, we know it's a problem. We're going to stop him. But then they couldn't do anything against him. It's really interesting to see how he was on the radar of the US and also of the Chinese, but nothing was done against him.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. Why couldn't the Chinese do anything against him? And it begs the question, was there state support for this in some way?
Yeah, the question is, couldn't they do anything, or didn't they want to do anything? I mean, China experts, also Christoph, who's a correspondent there, they say, I mean, Christoph, you can speak about it, but it's the likelihood is not really high that the Chinese state can't stop you from doing this, right, Christoph?
Yes. So if they really want to get you out of business, they get you out of business for whatever reasons. So it was at the beginning probably that they did not really want to do it. That's our impression. And another point is it was rather difficult for them to understand why the Americans were so angry about dual-use components. Because as I said earlier, it's not a rifle or a tank that's been sold. It's been components that can be used also for other purposes, and that's been probably the reason why they were not seeing this urgency. And what we also should remember is he set up his first company in 1998. At that time, the Iranian sanctions were not in place as they are today. So this is something that's developed. And when actually the Iranian sanctions or the Iran sanctions came, a lot of Chinese businesses were benefiting a great deal from it. So what European companies, what American companies have been sold to Iran was now replaced by Chinese companies. So there was actually also a business interest on the Chinese side to fill that gap. And if somebody complained, possible that they could have gotten him out of business, but maybe he had also support in the hierarchy, people that were shielding him.
And it's really interesting the priority the US are giving him at that time, because you see in the cables Condoleezza Rice is emphasizing on that and signing the cables, and then Hillary Clinton. And then we have been told from insiders from the administration at that time, it was even Barack Obama who mentioned that name to the Chinese and said, stop this guy. And but they didn't do it.
Let's talk a little bit about how you guys went about reporting this. I mean, Christoph, you're based in China. Philipp, you're in Germany, but looked at more of the US aspects of this and the European aspects. It is incredibly difficult to report in China. I know in the past it was easier to get business records. That's become more difficult. You mentioned that earlier. Sometimes you just can't get simple facts. Like you have to go to gravestones to find people's family trees to understand who their relatives are or where they were born or how old they are, stuff like that. Our colleagues in China have always worked like that. So tell us a bit about, you mentioned this started off with an idea with the Panama Papers, with a few names. How did you follow the breadcrumbs?
Yeah, we started from the outside. In the beginning, we asked the German authorities, did they hear about him in the beginning, just here in Germany? And they said, yes, we are aware of this guy. So this was already quite interesting. And then we asked American sources, and some were speaking quite openly about him at that time, because he was indicted in absentia in the US 2 times at the time already. So we had an indictment. We knew who the prosecutors were. So we had a lot of angles to follow this lead at that time. At that time, there was also a big openness to speak about him in the US. Later, maybe we speak about it later, but later that's completely stopped. But at that time, it was in 2019, in the beginning, they were quite open to speak about him because it also fit the narrative of a guy helping the bad Chinese and also a bad Chinese guy helping the bad Iranians. And it had quite a good start, this research. We got a lot of information at the beginning. Then we thought, well, now let's go to Israel, because Israel has always an eye on Iran and those who help Iran. Maybe we can get more information there. But then it already got tricky, because in Israel, it was very interesting. We knew from the cables that the Israelis were the ones who had him on the radar even before the US had him on the radar, that they were complaining about him in China before the US were complaining. But no one wanted to speak about him publicly. And we also knew that this first indictment in the US was caused by basically the Mossad giving a hint to the prosecutor in New York to follow this lead, but no one wanted to speak about it publicly. In the beginning, we didn't understand that, but it was, as experts there told us, that the ties between China and Israel are also very close, or have been very close at that time. And so the only things we heard were from a top senior intelligence guy on that was not on camera, but he was telling, this bastard Khalid is still around. So we experienced this person is important. And then COVID came. At that time, we still had the plan to go to China filming. As you mentioned, the conditions for journalism were a bit different at that time. But then COVID came, and we already learned at that time that it's going to be impossible to go there and film. And we have been already in touch with Christoph and working on the project. So in the end, it was Christoph going around with the camera and filming.
So, Christoph, talk a little bit about what it's like on the ground and what reporting techniques you can use
Yes.
to try to find out more about this.
Yeah, China is a very difficult ground to report, as you rightly pointed out. However, there is one thing that's still remarkably open, and this is the corporate registry in China. So you actually get a lot of information in those databases that you won't get in most European countries. You just need, first of all, to understand how they're working. And another problem is that a lot of Chinese journalists wouldn't dare to use those databases because the findings they would make there, they could never publish them. So once we had actually the first names from the indictments, companies that got blacklisted. So I was spending days and weeks in those databases and was connecting the dots and was trying to understand, first of all, at the computer, what kind of companies he had, how they're connected, what people played a role. And it's interesting to see actually also how the databases have evolved over those years. So the first names and companies I was looking into, that was in 2019. So I still could find names, date of births, and also mobile phone numbers of people that were involved here. So, for example, his brother or his lawyer, I could find their phone numbers at that point, not knowing who they were, but at least I could find all those information in there. And if you do look now into those databases, so you will not find that information anymore. And another thing which is a great feature, I have to say, in those Chinese databases is that they're also connected to a court database. So once you find a company, so it's connected to a database of court cases and court rulings. And that's how we also found free court cases Carly's companies were involved in, and we could then also approach those people and find out what kind of conflict they had with Carly. So all three cases were like civil cases where they were actually in a kind of dispute about whether Carly would need an end user certificate or not. So it was really the stuff we wanted to find in there. So from that point of view,
people who were worried about doing business with him and getting into legal
correct,
trouble
or
because
that
they're
they
selling
had
dual technologies.
correct. They had done business in the past with him, and they were refusing to deliver certain goods that he apparently wanted to sell or hand over to the Iranians, and they were not. They wanted to stop the business because it was unclear what those products were for. And but the Chinese courts ruled always in favor of Carly, so he's in the end gotten the material.
So what you're painting here is a picture of the wider network. This guy is not doing it by himself, right? You start off by looking at him, you pull the threads, you start to go into the business records in China, and then what do you find about, how does arms trafficking really work, or how does this dual-use technology trafficking really work? You have to get the courts on your side, as you just mentioned, but you also have to have partners. Are there foreigners involved in this? What kind of network were you able to paint?
Yeah, there was to our knowledge there were no foreigners involved. So Kali, what we can see from emails, is able to speak or write at least English quite well. So he was communicating in English. Hence he's calling himself also Carl, given himself a Western name. So how does it work? So he was setting up new companies almost on a monthly basis. So whenever the Americans blacklisted one company, he was setting up a new one and was then shipping with the new company to Iran. And that was a game that worked extremely well for him. So always setting up something new, and he wasn't even hiding it too much. So we undicked something more than 24 companies, and if you go to these addresses, then they all exist. And the interesting thing is that we got the impression that most of these people who are living there are actually family members or friends or something of his, who probably didn't even know that he was using their addresses in a kind of arms trafficking scheme. So you're knocking on doors, people opening the doors. You ask them, "Are you aware that here is this or that company, and they should have an annual turnover according to customs data of a couple $1 million a year?" And these people have no clue. But if you ask them, okay, where you're from, so then it's oftentimes the region where Carl Lee's been originally from. So probably like friends, family members, and something like that.
So it's basically a shell game. He's able to hide behind multiple companies. Can you tell us a little bit about what the stakes are here? Obviously, Iran is a bad actor. You mentioned earlier that Israel was one of the first countries to get on to Carl Lee. And that makes a lot of sense because obviously if they can produce ballistic missiles with better range, they can hit Israel. What are the real world consequences of Carl Lee's network and his success?
Yeah, he was portrayed, and even the volume he delivered to Iran, he was like the foreign key figure of the Iranian ballistic missile program. And so he enabled Iran to produce those missiles. And what we are seeing now, also today, is in a way, part of it are a result of it, like the Iranian attack on Israel with ballistic missiles, for example, a few months ago. We don't have final proof, but the likelihood is quite high that those ballistic missiles, as he enabled Iran to produce those ballistic missiles, that there is a connection to Carl Lee. And also, if we see the war in Ukraine, it's not so clear at the moment. It's more about drones, but there are from time to time indications that also ballistic missiles get delivered to Russia from Iran. And so you would have a connection there as well. So the stakes are quite high. You can draw basically the lines from the battlefields to these companies in Dalian.
That's really fascinating. And technology obviously is playing a bigger and bigger role in modern warfare, isn't it? Drones. Christoph, you mentioned earlier, these are chips that are getting sent. And I think, Philipp, you mentioned something, a gyroscope?
Gyroscope, yeah.
Gyroscope. So explain what that is and explain how technology is playing a role in warfare and how Carl Lee fits into that all.
Yeah, gyroscope is basically like one missile expert puts it that way, that it's like the ears and the eyes of a missile. The missile knows how it is in the air at the moment, like this or like this. So it helps the missile navigate. And those are things Iranians are not really able, or in the past have not been able to produce by themselves. There are a lot of things they can produce for the missile program, but there are critical components where they are not able. But there are also other things which are not so technological, like, as I mentioned before, graphite. Just graphite, like for the pens, more or less. But you could also use those for making jet vanes or aluminum to make the missiles lighter and to get a longer range for the missile. And those are things where the Iranians have problems to acquire them. And if you have like a merchant like Carl Lee who is delivering those in big volumes and in good quality, which is also important, and then it's quite an advantage. And also carbon. Christoph probably will later speak about the factory where he had been in the region where Carl is from, in Dalian. But he has like a factory where he's producing things like that. And this puts him in a position to, deliver that to the Iranians.
So, Christoph, what role does carbon play, and how were you able to get inside the factory?
Yes, I was. The door was open, so there was an opportunity for me to have a look inside. So, as Philipp said, and they produce graphite there. So, huge quantities. So, it's tons, loads of them are are just stored there. Yes, you could probably make pencils from it, but that's not the reason why you produce those amounts. But I think Carl Lee at one point understood that he could even make more money if he's not only buying and selling and is the middleman in between as a merchant, but that he can certainly produce certain key components that are used in a huge quantity, that he could produce them himself. And that's what they did with a factory which is like 120 kilometers north of Dalian. Yeah.
You asked before how he got into business and set up all this. And it's very interesting that he seems to be quite good connected. Like in Washington, there is the word that his grandfather was like a colonel in the People's Liberation Army, and that he went on a very good school in Dalian. This would explain why he's writing in English that well. But also, which is very interesting, the Chinese admit to the US in the WikiLeaks cables, where they had this exchange, that he worked for the state before, and he made use of those contacts when he got into the business, and this probably also helped him to own such a factory.
So he has military and state backing, basically. It sounds
probably,
like.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be your guess based on some of the biographical data. And then, of course, Christoph, that factory where he's producing graphite. You mentioned you could pretend, or you could say, well, this has other uses that aren't military, right? So you can hide behind that and say, look, this is for making pencils or whatever it is. And that's true of all dual use technology, right?
Correct. Yeah.
My last question is, where is he, to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, this was, of course, the main question we ask almost everybody along the way. And at one point, we were quite surprised that the Americans basically stopped talking to us. So a lot of people in the administration were relatively open until summer 2019, late 2019, early 2020. So they kept on talking, giving us a lot of information, and all of a sudden there was like nothing anymore. So and that was the moment where we started to think, what has happened? Why are they not talking anymore? And so when I went on the ground, going from door to door, asking for Carl Lee. So one person we met was suddenly asking the question, "Isn't he in prison? The person you have been looking for." So, and that was complete new information for us at that point. So, and we tried then to find more evidence for that. So, and I still remember one day Philipp came with an information he found on Wikipedia. Maybe you want to tell that little story.
Yeah, it was quite strange, because around the same time, I looked into the history of the Wikipedia entry of Carl Lee. There is one. And this was changed, but just for, I think, 30 minutes or something. Someone put there that he's in prison in Dalian. And then it was removed immediately. And it was absolutely strange. We didn't have an explanation, but it fit with what Christoph had from the reporting on the ground.
Yeah, and that was in the Chinese version of the Wikipedia, so that made it interesting. So somebody who had this information, and then just a few weeks before we actually published the book, I went a last time to the factory, and this time the gate was closed, but there was a kind of groundkeeper there who was taking care of the facility. So I was talking to him. I said to him, "Where is Carl Lee? Where is your boss?" So, and he was looking at me and said, "He's in prison. Don't you know?" And I asked, "So why is he in prison?" And then he said, "Look, he loved money too much. That's why they've taken him out of business. He was too greedy. He basically said, and so we have now two people. One who was living at one of the factories or one of the companies, who is pointing us in the direction of the prison, plus the guy working at the factory who directly said, "Look, he's in prison. He's been taken in custody in 2020." So, and our assumption is that there must have been a kind of deal between Washington and Beijing, probably during the time when there were the trade war negotiations between Xi Jinping and former President Donald Trump back then. And I think the Americans have just, put him on the table as a negotiating point, and the Chinese have taken him out of business. However, he's still on the FBI most wanted list with a bounty of $5 million, and that's probably also part of the deal, so that the Chinese have arrested him, but that nobody knows that he was arrested, that nobody can accuse the Chinese of having arrested one of their citizens on behalf of the Americans. So it's that's why there's a kind of murder, and nobody really talks about this anymore. But we are quite confident that he is in a detention center in Dalian at the moment.
Well, it's just amazing reporting. I can only imagine how difficult it all was. Of course, the book is called The Chinese Phantom in English. What's it called in German?
Die Jagd auf das chinesische Phantom. Quite similar.
Same.
The hunt for the Chinese Phantom.
The hunt for the Chinese. And you've just explained why it's called the Chinese Phantom. You know, after all this reporting, all the years you've put into this, you still are unsure, but your best guess is that he's in prison. Congratulations on a wonderful book. Of course, it reminds me of a little bit about Jolo, you know, who's the perpetrator of the 1MDB scandal we wrote the book, The $1 Billion Whale, about. I mean, he's living in China. Dave will never admit that he's in China. We did our reporting that showed he was in China. And then a lot of people that were connected to him got arrested, but no one ever mentioned that was to do with the 1MDB scandal. So it's very similar to how you've just described. How does China clean up corruption? How does it deal with these problems? Does it quietly? And if reporters like yourselves didn't write about it, we would never know anything. So congratulations, and thanks for coming on Whale Hunting.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to Philipp and Christoph for joining us. The Chinese Phantom is available for pre-order now and is out at bookstores on August the 29th. That's it for this week, and thanks for listening. The best way to stay up to date with whale hunting is to hit follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can also subscribe to the Whale Hunting newsletter for updates on the shadowy lives of the powerful and ultra-wealthy at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. That's whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean and Claire Urban. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.